very quick, and you didn't need to implement any specific codes. So this is one way. The other way is called the model first. I'm going to create another model. And this time, I'm going to choose empty model. This is the model first way. See, if you have an empty model, you go to the toolbox and you start building the entities with relationships and stuff, start adding whatever you have. And once you're finished, you can right-click somewhere and choose Generate a database from a model. So you can start from your model. Once you're finished, of course, who does this? Usually guys who like designers, right? I assume you will like more the third way. Because usually people who love designers are people who don't like to code too much, either in .NET or in SQL. Okay? So you just want to get the result very quickly. So if that's the case, I can just choose a database here, which one to connect to, and don't need to create anything. And it will just create all the statements for you in SQL. So this is the second approach. The third approach is called code first. Now, code first has been there for some time, but actually the final version has just came up like, I think 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago. So code first as a real technique or a real approach is fairly new. In this way, I'm assuming you're a hardcore developer. You don't like designers, you don't like databases that much. You just want to write code, and from the code, generate the model and generate the database. Actually, you don't even see the model in your application, in the design time. .NET, the entity framework, creates the model at runtime and runs it for you. You don't have to worry about the database that much. So, as you can see, these three approaches are there. Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. I've written them here. So very quickly, just to review, if you're really good with databases, or you have some, a good team of database designers, or an existing database, then probably you should start with the database first model. Usually, remember, big enterprise or enterprises, they usually have database team, right? That's why usually in big enterprises they go with the database first model. Everybody has this idea that developers are people who always mess with things. Database people are just people organized. They are not as productive as developers. Okay, they just stop your code saying something is wrong with it, but they're usually more organized. That's why in big organizations they tend to go to the database first. If you're building your own application, starting from scratch, small company or something, of your own, then you can choose one of these two, the code first or the database. Of course, the classes that are created for you by Entity Framework, can you add to them? What do you think? I have some classes generated by Entity Framework. I need to add some stuff. If you go in and modify the classes, the next time you refresh from the database, they will be removed. So the solution is to do what? Partial classes, remember? Create your partial classes somewhere else and start or adding your own thing. There's also something called T4 template. I'm not going to explain this in detail, but it's something like you're controlling how to create the classes. You can interfere with how .NET is creating these classes for you by something called T4 template. Search about it. It's a very powerful thing if you're an advanced Entity Framework developer. So the best thing about this, in my opinion, is that anytime you change something in the database, you just right-click and say, update. And it goes and updates everything in your project. And the problems in that are very minimum. Usually it just goes on very fine. Okay, the model first, so it's just for people who like designing. Remember that you are not controlling the database and the code as much in the model first. And from my experience, it's the least used one, model first. First, when the Entity Framework was released, it was used a lot. But now with code first, everybody is moving to code first more than the model. So code first is the new thing. And by the way, if you're planning on using code first, it will not work with Entity Framework 4. Have you heard about 4.1? You should. There's Entity Framework 4.1. It was released, as I told you, like a month and a half ago. It has this new feature, the code first approach. So I've already installed it on my machine, but you should go and download it if you're planning on trying this. It's a simple download. You just install it with your Visual Studio 2010. Okay, so that's the two approaches. I found this, I've stolen this from a website called the Data Farm. But I do not really agree on the way they're doing it. That's, as it says here, so if you prefer a visual designer, then if you don't prefer it, you can go to code first. As you can see, I don't necessarily agree with this. This could be a general guideline. I mean, you could be, for example, you could have an existing database and decide to go with code first. It's possible. I've seen people doing it. Okay? But this is a general guideline on which one to choose for your application. Okay, before I move to the next, of course, as you can see, I've skipped using the code first, right? I've shown you quickly how to use the model and the database. The code first, I'll show it in the last slide, if I have time, when discussing Framework 4.1, Entity Framework 4.1. Before I move on, are there any questions regarding the concept? You should know now about these three and whether you want to use Entity Framework or not. Before moving, from now on I'll be discussing some tips to improve the performance of your Entity Framework application. Do you have any questions before moving to that? Good. So, the things I'm discussing here will work on all three approaches. Have you heard about lazy loading? Okay. This code is an example of using Entity Framework. If this is your first time, try reading it. I'll give you like 1 minute or half a minute, a couple of seconds. Try reading this code. Even if you're new to Entity Framework, I suspect you understood what this is doing. I mean, what it's saying is something like saying this in the second line, from customers, I want to get C. C is like the entire table, where the company name starts with A. Right? This is very much like a normal SQL statement, and that's the point of using Entity Framework. And then what it does, what you do is you go through a loop, seeing every company, displaying it in a console. Okay? There's one thing I need. This is a question. When do you think the actual SQL statement is executed? The call to the database. When do you think it's executed? In which line? In console.read line? All agree? It's executed the first time you start needing the actual data. So even though in the second line you said select, it will not select until you start using C. When did you start using C? In the for loop, right? So at that time, it will go on and execute the real SQL statement at the database and return it back to you. This is called lazy loading, and I'll explain more in the next lines. See, I'll tell you something even more. Go to the second loop for each order as order in C.orders. Now, this might seem a surprise, but if you run the profiler, the SQL Server profiler, you will see that there's a second select statement executed. You know what this means? Multiple round trips to the database. This is why I'm telling you it depends on how you develop. You need to understand these things. Usually, if you're going to loop through every record in customers, this will be very expensive, right? Because let's say you have 200 customers, and for each customer you have, let's say, 100 orders. Every time, I mean, you'll call 200 times, and for each one you will call 100 times. You will have a lot of SQL statements, a lot of multiple rounds to the database. Be careful with that. This is called lazy loading.